Well, I hope like heck we're live and this thing is working. I can't really tell. We had another little snafu, which is 100% on my end, about when and how we are trying to coordinate between Zoom and trying to merge our Facebook pages of what has been Christian History Today, along with our new Center for Christian History. So bear with us, anybody who might be floating around out there watching as we're watching and presenting. But certainly for those who are watching this on YouTube, I hope like heck we have edited all this other me not doing a great job out of our learning time today. So hi, this is Nick Walters. I am the founder and the kind of director, if you will, of the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. And you are watching one of our live events that we do each month on some aspect of Christian history. And currently we are in the month of December. So we thought, what a great time to be able to talk about what are known as Christ myths, right? What history is telling us about various Christmas traditions. So thank you for joining us today as we go through this myriad of slides that I'm going to discuss today on a couple of different pieces and parts. So hopefully everything is following along okay in the way that you are seeing it there. If I totally mess it up, I'll go back and record a different way for YouTube. So our focus today is really twofold. Two things we're going to follow over. Who were the Magi and who were they not? And then also, when might be the birth of Christ? So let me just say this as an opening statement, as kind of the way that things are rolling. Typically, this is something that I teach in my ongoing Sunday school classes. And so we've used part of the history and some of the background to tell part of a Sunday school lesson. And that fits fine enough. For our purposes for the Center for Christian History, though, we are not teaching a Sunday school lesson. We are teaching about Christian history. So I've had to kind of back in from a different way, even though we use Scripture as part of our reference, as we always will, during and using that as when can be and need be for the Center for Christian History. So bear with me if I go off into Sunday school mode more than history mode, but hopefully that won't make too much of a difference. But two things in particular we want to focus on because it relates to what's going on with Christian history are that just exactly who were the Magi, who they were not, more than likely, and when might be the birth of the church, the birth of Jesus Christ. So for those of you who may not be joining us later in our life, know that this is brought to you by the Center for Christian History, which is headquartered at Mississippi College in Clinton, Mississippi. Our website is there, centerforchristianhistory.com. You can learn more about us there. In particular, Christian History Today, which is something that you will be able to see every day of the week. Another little tidbit or something that actually happened on this particular day in Christian history. It's there on our website. We have a Facebook page. We have Instagram as well. You can follow along if you are interested to know just a little bit, not the whole 9 yards, but just a little bit about what happened today in Christian history. We also have, as part of what you're watching now, is a monthly no-cost online sessions that we give from different subject matter experts on different aspects of Christian history. So follow along and get our newsletter or anything else like that to know when we are having these events live, and you're welcome to join them live as long as I don't mess it up like I'm doing right now for some of you who might be trying to click on via Zoom. But there's no cost to you, and all of these are going back to our YouTube page, so you'd be able to follow that as well. We have in-person events that we are doing to teach different aspects of Christian history, so you can watch about part of those. And we have a podcast and radio spots that depending on the time that you're actually watching this, if you're watching this as we're recording it in December of 2024, in the first quarter of 2025, we will be starting the podcast and different radio spots built around Christian history today. So much for advertising. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, first off and foremost, understand that the things that I'm going to delve off into today as it relates to who were the Magi and were they there at the birth of Christ and Jesus's birthday, you are getting part of what is heavily relied on my opinion. Hopefully that's a fairly educated opinion and not something that it was just pulled out randomly. But understand there are other people who are full of well-known scholarship that would disagree, and that's okay, particularly when we don't know exactly. People have differing opinions, and just be aware of that, and that's all right. If somebody says, man, you sure did a lot of calisthenics to get to that idea and to get that idea about where you came up with that, that's okay. But part of it is what is wrong with this picture. We have a joke around my household that anytime we put out the nativity scene around Christmas time, I always take the three Magi, or the three kings, the three wise men, as they are called in different places and parts, and I always move them to the other side of the mantle or on the other side on another table in another place to represent that they were 2 years out from the time of being at the nativity scene. I do not believe that the Magi were at Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. That goes back into a Sunday school lesson, and it goes back to other ideas about how well you might be able to trust the Bible and understand what it says. But you are getting my 2 cents on part of that about why they weren't there. So, but we do want to start with Scripture to give us an idea to tell us more about these Magi. So I am reading from the ESV, from the English Standard Version. You might have a different translation that you would be reading from Scripture. But let's start off by at least going to Matthew chapter 2 and in verses 1 through 6 as our first part of discussing and looking at the Magi. Remember that the book of Matthew is written to the Jews of that time frame by Matthew, who certainly had his Jewish creds as being a tax collector. And so there's a whole lot of, hey, remember this was prophesied, and now I'm telling my fellow Jews this is what took place in Matthew, and so that you get that peppered throughout this. But we start off with this in chapter 2, verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, okay, that gets to the time of our second part of this, of exactly when was Jesus born. So there's a little clue. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, who is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, that's important, I think, and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And that's what we see a lot, right? In Matthew is where he says things, so it is written, and others say, so it is written, so that his Jewish audience would understand this is in what would have been the Tanakh, or the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, as modern day folks look at it. And you, O Bethlehem, picking up in verse 6, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people. All right, so let's jump into some of that so that we understand kind of what we're talking about. What are the Magi? What are they exactly? Wise men, Magi. Well, the term in the Greek that you actually would pull from that verse is the word megos, all right? And the word magician comes from this same term, these same words. It's only used 5 times in the entirety of the New Testament, twice in Acts. When it's used, it is specifically there to describe magicians. And these were magicians that the apostles and the missionaries would have run into as the church was being developed. So that is this word magos or megos. Okay, I will very quickly reference tell you that I am not a Greek scholar, and so sometimes we get a little South Mississippi verbiage and pronunciation in some of these Greek words. So just be aware of that for all the Greek scholars that may be watching this and getting a little giggle. All right. But in the Old Testament book of Daniel, there are references to Magi as well, to these magicians. Their magician status, particularly those from the Old Testament, those that are there from the Babylonian captivity time, were likely instituted and created as their own version of magicians by Daniel. Daniel 4 and Daniel 5 very specifically say that while he was in Babylonian captivity, after his time of being in the burning furnace with his 3 compadres, and before the time he gets into the lion's den, by his interpretation of dreams from Nebuchadnezzar, as well as his Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar, that excuse me, that Daniel was the chief magician. And so during his time of being chief magician, there is a very strong school of thought, one that I believe happens to be true, that Daniel instituted this whole network of people who after him would become these magicians, these magi, these wise people who maybe or maybe did not have the ability to interpret dreams as well as Daniel did, but they certainly could pontificate things, and they could get an idea of what was to come. One of the ways they were able to decide what things were to come and what was going on was by watching the stars. There's a whole series of conversations and learning that anyone could go through about constellations from a Hebrew perspective, but that's another story for another day. So one of the things that the Magi recognize, as you can see in verse 2 there from Matthew 2, is they recognize that he was born King of the Jews. So when they showed up, they were understanding, and the way I expect that this all rolled out, and again, this is in my perspective, but they understood that prophecy and those other prophecies that were given to them from not only those things that Daniel would have given them during that time, but also other prophecies that would have taken place coming from Jerusalem and prophets after the Babylonian captivity. So these magi would have been not only kept up with things that were going on in Hebrew prophecy, but they would have kept up with other prophecies that were made in other cultures and other languages and other religions throughout the world of what we would call the greater part of Asia, the Middle East, other spots like that they would have had access to and that they would have heard of and they would have seen from. So to know then that there was a prophecy saying that he was born the King of the Jews. They're already watching the stars. These folks did not only astrology, but also astronomy. And so they would understand what different times, things that were going on by watching the stars. And they note that Matthew tells us this, that they saw his star, not just a star. So when they saw whatever this anomaly was in the sky, it was fitting within the time frame that they understood, hey, there is something here different that they had not seen before. They knew the sky and the constellations and the stars and what they could see and what they could not see, as well as probably any other group anywhere on the surface of the earth at the time. That doesn't mean that somebody who was in another empire in another place in South Africa or in South America or in Northern Europe Doesn't mean that they had a lock on all the constellations, but these guys were absolutely watching constellations all the time because it helped them to do their magician, air quote, magician work of being able to pontificate and understand what might be coming down the pike. So the other thing that's important to note when we look in this in verse 2, and this goes to the idea of about why the Magi were not there at the time of the birth and who they were. Notice of what is actually said in verse 2 about part of this was that in the Greek where they say, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Next verse, "For we saw his star when it rose." Now, the Greek modifier, the part of the language that we, from the term "we saw" there in the Greek, all right, it is modifying when it rose. It is not modifying his star. Modifying means, right, supporting, modifying, expanding on, focusing on. So when they say, we saw his star when it rose, the modifier is not on his star. It's on we rose, which means it's modified by saying, we were in the east when we saw it rising. We were somewhere else. You could say that for sure, right? Based off of the way of the structure that the Greek is there, that we were somewhere else when we saw it rising. We know that they came from the east, right? And so since we know that that is the way from whence they came, that's another piece of a clue that helps to get an idea to say they were not there whenever Jesus' star rose. When they went to Jesus and when they gave him those three gifts of myrrh, frankincense, and gold, it says that's part of the tradition of why we think there were three Magi. Scripture certainly doesn't tell us how many there were. It doesn't say there was a magician, right? So it's plural. So it was at least two of them. But who knows how many were a part of the crew? Who know how many people came and showed up? It doesn't say specifically about that, okay? But notice that in verse 3, here's another component of that Herod was tarasso. That's the Greek word that means troubled, or your translation may say deeply disturbed, or highly concerned maybe about that. So when they came, he was deeply troubled. So this is the same word as what the apostles felt whenever they saw Jesus walking on the water. It is the same word that describes what Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, who we'll talk about a good bit here in a moment, that John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, felt whenever he was administering priestly duties in the temple. When the angel Gabriel appears to him and tells him, Zechariah, that he and his wife Elizabeth are going to have a child after being barren their entire marriage, that he's actually going to have a child in his old age. It's the same word. So think about that you're minding your business, sitting in your lazy boy recliner, watching reruns of, As the World Turns, and a angel shows up there in your den. You were tarasso, okay? You were deeply troubled, deeply disturbed. You didn't go, oh, excuse me, could you move a little bit to the right? I can't see the screen. In our modern day vernacular, we might even say, man, they were freaking out, okay? Whenever Herod was. The other thing is, and this is the hyperbole that Matthew uses, we have different uses of scripture, different uses of language all throughout the Bible, and hyperbole is one of those that we would see. So Matthew says that all Jerusalem was tarasso as well. But there were plenty of people besides just Herod himself. The first reading of this, or some readings of this, might say, well, yeah, Herod was concerned, and he was concerned, because there was some other guy who was supposed to be king of the Jews. Well, that's concerning enough. But what about all the people? There's not every single human. We understand that it's hyperbole. When I come home, when all of my family is here, I walk in and say, y'all have left on every light in this household. Okay, well, they don't leave on literally every light, but I'm trying to make the point. It looks to me like every time I turn around, y'all have left the light on. All right, it's the same kind of thing. They were scared. They were concerned, all of these people. So what in the world is so scary about just three dudes on a camel? I don't think that we could say three dudes on a camel are going to scare, quote unquote, all of Jerusalem, or really are going to scare Herod. And in a city like Jerusalem, where people were coming and going, you got to remember Israel, the kingdom of Judea, is centered right in the middle of this pathway but of going down to Egypt and all of Africa and going back up into Asia and back over to the Middle East. It was a bottleneck, right, for land travel. So having a couple of dudes, 2, 3, 5, however many there were, coming in on camels on any particular day, I can't imagine that that is anything that would make all of Jerusalem worried. What I think happened is that these guys would have traveled with a full military escort. They would have been given the okay by the emperor and or king of what I believe is Parthia. I'm getting to that in just a second. I believe they were Parthians. That they came with all of this retinue and all of the pomp and circumstance that would have come from the time of them arriving into Jerusalem. And I think with all of that is why we get everybody would have been terrasso. So let's go back a little bit and rewind just a little bit about how in the world do we get to a Parthian and what would a Parthian be. We got to go back to Alexander the Great. And so this red that you're seeing on the screen right here is basically the whole place that Alexander would have conquered during his time in his conquest, right? Before it all ended in 323 BC. After Alexander died at the ripe old age of 31 or 32 years old, having conquered the known world to him, he divided up his kingdom amongst his four most loyal generals. One of those generals' name was Seleucus. You can see that in the Seleucid Empire. So he gets this big old chunk, just like Ptolemy, who was another one of his generals, had all of this big part of Egypt, right? So the four people that got that's another history lesson, is who got what chunk and who got what piece and what did that look like. Seleucus gets a big part of that, and it becomes, after Seleucus, into what is known as the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids are the ones, by the way, who are governing Judea during the time that the Maccabees actually revolted in Jerusalem and took back over the temple in Jerusalem and cleaned the temple back out, which is why we have Hanukkah. But that's another story for another day as too. But notice this country right over here of Parthia. And so the Parthians were connected physically and were a part of what was the empire that would have been taken over by Alexander the Great. So what's a Parthian? It is today located in what would be northeastern Iran. It began in roughly 247 BC and it ended around 224 AD. So it had a good, healthy, 80-year run there, right? For it to be operating. And for it to be in as an empire. It technically was conquered by Alexander the Great. Excuse me, I'm getting a little parched. It's technically conquered by Alexander the Great, but at that time it was a part of the greater Achaemenid Empire. So the Achaemenid Persians, another story for another day. You got to keep in mind all these different pockets and parts of people and people groups get all kind of merged together in a part of what would be really understanding ancient world history and what all these groups, who fought over who and who became what to which, and that is not part of what we're going to dig in today. But so they were a part of a good part of their part of the original part of Parthia was a part of that. So for that reason, they had this mix of Persian that came from the a part of the Persian Empire, but also the Greek, or the Hellenist, as it's often called, the Greek Empire, of culture and language and different influences, that they were this melting pot of kind of these two cultures that would have come together. Systematically, over time, as they became more and became stronger and stronger, they would have broken away from the Achaemenid Empire and formed their own group of being Parthia. And I'm giving you the quicker version, believe it or not. But they go into that big Seleucid territory and systematically start to peel it apart to become part of their own empire. They controlled much of what was then the Silk Road. There's another Silk Road, right, that we know about from the 1400s that Marco Polo is going back to China to trade. But before all that, particularly with the Han Dynasty of China, there still was a Silk Road, and I'll show you a map here in a minute of that. But they also controlled Babylon during this time, that the Parthians, as they were taking territory away from the Seleucid Empire and becoming the Parthians themselves. And so they incorporated a lot of the work of these Babylonian magicians, and they had a good bit of influence within the Parthian court. So whenever they took Babylon over from the Seleucids, those magicians, which I believe and others believe too, got their start from Daniel. These same Magi of Parthia, as they now were, instead of being Magi of the Seleucid Empire, or Magi from the Persians. Remember, the Persians are the ones that took over and beat the Babylonians. But that's even even further back history. So they were still around, and they didn't get rid of these magicians because these magicians could tell people things. I don't know exactly what it all looked like. I know there are scholars that do. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them. But there was still plenty of magic work going on within the empire at that time. So this gives you an idea about 1 AD, which certainly would have been during that same time period of what the Parthian Empire looked like. So it's here in the dark green that you're seeing. All this parts that would have been the part of Iran and Iraq and part of this. But it stops right over here when it's bumping up against the Roman Empire, which is what we'll talk about here in just a second. But you can also see then down here where they would have gotten a hold of what was going on from Babylon, and that they would have turned as a part of that Parthian Empire. So it's still around for another 200 years, after they very likely showed up in Jerusalem anyway. So this is to give you a map of what the height of the Roman Empire looked like at the time. Understand this big part of the Danube River over here in Western Europe, because of the different Germanic tribes, Rome was never able to penetrate this area of what would have been that German culture as an idea and understanding. But all the way down here, there's a line. And that line this is where the Parthians would have bumped up directly to the Roman Empire. And here's a little bit better of an idea. And this also goes, hopefully you can see this map well enough, these yellow lines that show you where the Silk Road was going. So no matter what you did, or no matter which path you would have taken other than a water route, okay, you still, unless you were going back and coming through this part of the Roman Empire and then hitting the Red Sea here and going all the way around the bottom of what you and I would today know as all this parts of Arabia, to be able to get back to the to the Han Empire and be able to get the spices and the silk and the other thing for trade. You had to go through the Parthians to get there. I'm sure there could have been some other route somebody else took, but these were not the trade routes. So the Parthians had a great lock on not only the trade that would have come from China or that would have come from India or that would have come from any of those spots of traders and people that wanted to trade back with the Roman Empire, but certainly going the other way too. So they were smack dab in the middle and had a whole lot of a say-so of exactly who came through and who did not come through. And so it was an important piece to note about that. So Rome butts up against Parthia, and from about 53 BC until the time of the end of the Parthian Empire, there's all kind of battle going on. We're not going to go through each one of them. I know you're saying, thank goodness. But the first Roman and Parthian war took place in 53 BC. Always keep in mind, right, anytime we're doing BC for before Christ or before the Christian era, or as some scholars call it, before the Common Era, BCE. I tend to choose in the way I was raised up and believe, which is BC for before the time of Christ. And even that time is not exactly right, I don't think, as we'll talk about here in a minute. But the first war took place in 53 BC. Remember, we count down, right? So if it's BC, the next year after 53 is actually 52. So keep that in your brain. This was a major conflict in what was a battle called Carrhae, that it was in modern day Turkey. And I'll show you that on a map in just a second. Now, don't get this confused with the Battle of Cannae, Cannae, for those of you who are historians that like to keep up with how the Romans and the Carthaginians fought each other with Hannibal the Great and his elephants and all the rest of that. That's the Battle of Cannae. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Carrhae. All right, so it's a different battle, way different part of the time frame, and way across from each other on where those things took place. So Rome was governed at this time under what's known as the First Triumvirate. So when they tried to, as Rome was growing more and more, one of the things that the Roman Senate decided that it would do is that the countryside was getting so big that we will divide this up to 3 different groups who all get their marching orders from the Senate, but they get to be this kind of hyped up governor slash president slash ultimate allied commander ruler of a military ruler who gets to govern these particular areas. And these 3 spots in this first triumvirate were Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus. Now, so Pompey is here. Pompey is this picture. This is Julius Caesar, and this is Crassus. Crassus was incredibly wealthy. As a matter of fact, some of you may ever have used that term or heard somebody use that term. Well, that lady's as rich as Crassus, okay? It meant for those of us who were old folks that she was as rich or he was as rich as Jed Clampett, and we might say today Warren Buffett and Bill Gates combined, right? That he was super duper duper rich. But he wasn't that great of a military leader. And so one of the things that he wanted to do was to prove to his counterparts, Julius Caesar and Pompey, who were both certainly military leaders in their own right, that he, by golly, could do something in his neck of the woods that he was governing. And he was governing that neck of the woods, of that part of that you and I would call today in Turkey. And so he loses at this battle of Carrhae. His son actually dies in battle while this goes on. So it's humiliating for him, but it is a pretty serious head bump with this these folks from Parthia, as well as it was getting into people's pocketbooks because of their control of this Silk Road. So that's one of the first times that the Parthians and the Romans butt heads. Later, during the time of the Second Triumvirate, which we'll look at here in just a little bit, both Mark Antony and Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's nephew, before he got that name Augustus Caesar, which we'll get to in a moment as we talk about the birth of Christ. They both, in different leadership framework, both tried to push the Parthians back in a whole series of conflicts that lasted for about a dozen years, but they were not able to do that, all right, by governing Rome. Keep in mind, too, that Herod the Great, as in the Herod the Great whose name we just read, who was obviously the one that we know of from the, excuse me, if I knew how to mute it, I would do it. Gracious. Oh, we can edit that out. There's bound to be a mute button. Sorry about that. This is the same Herod the Great of all the time that we know of when the Magi came to visit. Herod the Great becomes king of Judea in 37 BC. So while he is king of Judea, these Parthian wars are still taking place. And there's other Parthian wars that would take place after this with Rome. And so they're battling each other, as you can see, happens for a heck of a long period of time, right? These 200 years or so plus. Now, this happens from the time until Herod actually dies in 1 BC. There are scholars, and we'll get to this in a minute, who believe very solidly that Herod died in 4 BC. But the record is not consistent in part of that. So Herod would have been very well aware of who these Parthians were because this thing was taking place right north of where he was governing. So if a host of Parthians, not 3 dudes on a camel, if a host of Parthians show up in Jerusalem looking for a king of the Jews in about 2 BC, which is when I think Jesus was born, and you'll see that in a moment, Herod absolutely is terrasso. He is troubled. He is concerned. What in the world are all these Parthians doing showing up, number one? And number two, they're here looking for this king of the Jews. I'm super worried about that, right? I mean, so Matthew tells us, right, that he continues on to say one of the things that Herod does is he consults all of the Jewish knowledge brokers, right? He gets the scribes and others and says, hey, what does prophecy say in your Jewish literature about where this king of the Jews is to be born? And if you recall the story, they tell him it's in Bethlehem. And so he sends a crew down to murder all of the boys that would have been of that age. I believe it was, and Scripture can back that up, right? Any boys that are 2 years or under, that he wanted to be able to kill all of them because he didn't want there to be anybody that he had to worry about being his successor as king of the Jews, because he was quote unquote king of the Jews as far as the leader of the Jewish people. Keep in mind, Herod killed a bunch of his children, his sons and others too. He was a paranoid dude for a bunch. He did some good things as far as what he built and what he actually structured and by putting brick and mortar together, which was terrific. But outside of that, we certainly know about his murder of the innocents, as it's sometimes known, or his massacre of the innocents, as that's known throughout history. But when he sends Herod, Luke tells us in chapter 2, which is, in Luke, chapter 2 is where we get the birth story that so many of you read each Christmas or have maybe read in your church that we'll get to in just a moment. But Matthew says that Herod sent them looking for a paidion, okay, which is the Greek word that is used here for a child, and not a briphos, which is a baby. Luke says that it was a briphos. Luke tells us in Luke chapter 2 that the shepherds did not find a pedion swaddled in the manger. He was a briefos, a baby that was there. Now, these aren't, things that are lighting up everybody's fire all at once, but it's kind of a collection of different components and pieces that add to the point that the Magi were not there at the time of the birth of Jesus, that he had been 2 years old. Remember, the star rose. They saw his star. They still had to get all their stuff packed up and hoof it from Parthia, however long that took, to be able to get to the place where Jesus was. And wherever he was, whether he was back in Nazareth or whether he was actually in Bethlehem, I believe he was in Nazareth. And that's why they had to, Joseph and Mary and Jesus had to hoof it out of there and get and get over to Egypt. But there are little components and pieces that help us to think through that. All right, now let's move to the idea of when Jesus was born. What does that look like? Well, still sticking right there in Luke chapter 2, you know that we look at the beginning of Luke chapter 2, where he says very specifically that a decree came from Caesar Augustus. This is the same Augustus Caesar or Caesar Augustus that we just mentioned earlier. Remember, Caesar is that name of what we would say emperor, right? I mean, this was a way to be able to name them. We know that Caesar Augustus was Octavian, but he was Julius Caesar's nephew. He actually was the very first person to receive the title Caesar from the Roman Senate. Julius just kind of took it on himself. The way I always try to remember who came first between Julius and Augustus is that July, our month of July, is named for Julius, and Augustus is the one for whom is named August, our month. So that's how I always remember who came first, was July comes before August. That was a little bonus from for watching this video these past 45 minutes and listening to me cough whenever I had water go down the wrong pipe. So this census that was created was done for taxes. It was not military service. It was a way to be able to figure out you had to go back to where one of these awful tax collectors like Levi, Matthew, or Zacchaeus, or one of them would have been, and you would have had to go back in order to be able to pay your taxes. And that was, of course, the whole reason that they were headed back to Jerusalem, headed back to Nazareth. Rewind. Why it was that Joseph and Mary were coming from Nazareth back to Bethlehem, where Joseph's people came from, right? So what we notice in Luke chapter 2 is in verse 2 that says that when Quirinius was governing Syria, the New King James Version and the Christian Standard Bible translate it this way as governing instead of being the governor or the governor. The word in the Greek is actually a verb. So it is Quirinius was governing Syria. He was not the governor of Syria. And that's a distinction that makes a point for trying to put together the idea of exactly when it was that Jesus was born. It's important to know time frame wise what that meant on that was he was governing Syria, but that does not mean that he was the governor of Syria. All right. So the way that under the Second Triumvirate and others were divided up, as you can see in this kind of color phrase, the way it was the color that was done. There were these different sections and these different parts that would have been the way that the Senate and others would have divided up the Roman Empire for its governing. But one of the things I want to point to your attention over here, and this being modern day Turkey in here, in Galatia, right, as in the book of Galatians, is this territory called Cilicia. And Cilicia is connected right here to Syria. So when we talk about Quirinius being governing Syria, not the governor of Syria, understand that he was a military commander in this part of Cilicia at the time that took place. And just to give you an idea of the topo of that, there was a group called Homonadacians, and the Homonadacians were a group, another people group, who lived in this central part of what we would call Turkey, and primarily lived on this side of the Taurus Mountains. So the Taurus mountain range would have gone straight through here. Now, I didn't say the Tarsus. This is the town of Tarsus, for those of you who are maybe thinking about Paul the Apostle, that he came from Tarsus. This was the Tarsus Mountains. And so Quirinius was governing Syria, right down here, because there was no governor of Syria at the time, as I'll show you here in just a second. And he was the military leader here, trying to keep these Homodasians in line on behalf of the empire, of the Roman Empire. So what they add to his watch is, hey, other duties as assigned to you, specifically Quirinius, is you need to be watching over and governing things down in Syria until we get a governor. One of the reasons for that is, and don't worry, this is not going to be on the final, but these are a list of who a bunch of different Syrian governors were. Quirinius will be governor of Syria as the governor. But at the time frame that we're talking about, and the time frame that I would submit as part of what I believe is the the time frame of when Jesus was born, from 4 to 1 BC, there are no records. There could have been somebody who was governor. I don't think so. The Romans were pretty good about writing things down. And so whoever was governor during this 3 to 4 year time period right here, nobody knows. And then, so this Julius Caesar that you see here is a guy named for Gaius Vipsanius, is named for Vipsanius, is named for Julius Caesar. No, that's not the Julius Caesar. So nobody knows, right? There aren't any records of who was the governor from 4 to 1 BC of Syria, which goes back to the whole point of what Scripture says, which is that Quirinius was governing Syria. All right, so let's click on. Hey, we're coming around the mountain here. It's not going to take us that much long. But when was Jesus born? I'd submit to you the date that I like to kind of follow is September 29th, 2 BC. Now, do I know that for sure? No, I don't. Am I thinking why? I'm about to drag you through it, okay, on for those of you who haven't totally passed out. Just to give creds of where this idea came from, Chuck Missler, if you are familiar with his teaching ministry, as well as many commentaries that I've read through, as well as different historical journals that would have written about this time frame, is where I'm pulling all of this together, including about when Quirinius was governing Syria. So hang with me as we go through this. So Luke says in this whole in this book 2, chapter 2 of his gospel, that of course that the shepherds were in the fields, which means that winter is not possible. So the idea of October and November at the latest date of when Jesus could have been born, because it starts to get too cold and there's not any grass out there for the sheep to eat. So it totally goes away with December 25th, which you know is another story for another day about how that was actually adopted during the time of Constantine around the Saturnalia, which was a pagan festival. And there's all kinds of pagan festival stuff that we incorporate into the story of Christmas, including wreaths and Christmas trees, but that's another show for another day. So the idea that it was December, October, November would have been the latest time frame, because it certainly wasn't happening during winter. So where do we get the idea that, and as has been put forth some of the place, that 4 BC is actually the time? Well, this comes from the Jewish writer Josephus, right? And Josephus writes a whole great deal about the history of the Jewish people. We get a whole lot of information from Josephus on a whole bunch of different subjects. But we also can go back, and scholars can go back and pull apart and see where Josephus got some things wrong. And I think this is one of those places where he got it wrong. He says that Herod died in 4 BC. And he bases that off of the time that an eclipse also took place, okay, in 4 BC. But an eclipse also took place in 1 BC, and there are several historical references to Herod's death that would have put that his time of death in 1 BC instead of 4 BC. One of those references is about coinage and when what different coins were issued at different times that would have had King Herod the Great's picture on there and his likeness, I guess we should say, of that. It was not unusual for an emperor or a king's successor to begin governing and or ruling and or maybe even having the influence of knowing this dude is going to be the king or the emperor whenever the current one dies off. This is who's going to be taking their place. And so to be able to know that and understand that that was coming on is certainly part of the thing that Herod did with his 3 sons, one of them being Archelaus, who was one of his sons, who totally messes everything up, which is why Pontius Pilate has to come to Judea to govern. So that's one piece. One of the very early on Christian writers, and one of the ones that if you were ever really going to study that part of your Christian history, would be to know about Irenaeus of Lyon in France. Irenaeus writes that it was 40 years from the beginning of Augustus Caesar's rule that would have pinpointed back to the time from Jesus' death, that would have gone back from the time of when he actually was born. Okay, so he backtracks that, and if you did that from the beginning of Augustus's rules, and say from the time that Jesus died, and backtracked into that, that meant Jesus would have been born in around 6 BC. If indeed you believe that it took a couple of years, a year and a half, or however long it took for the star to rise, for the Magi to realize that the star had risen, for them to understand by searching the Hebrew scriptures and other things about the prophecy, and then to be able to hoof it over with all their whole entourage and come to Jerusalem. So assume then that that would have taken 2 years for that to take place. If indeed they showed up at 4 BC, and did that, that would have meant that Jesus would have had to have been born in 6 BC. If he were born in 6 BC, it totally throws off John the Baptizer's ministry and time frame, and it throws off Jesus' ministry and timelines as well too. So if you were trying to add all of that up into one piece, it really doesn't add up. So for that reason, I don't believe that that was the right time period. All right, so what about 2 BC? Could that actually be in the place? Well, Tertullian, who was also an early on writer of Christian commentary, he's actually the person who gives us the term Trinity, which you are probably aware. The word Trinity does not show up in the Bible anywhere, but he is the one that uses that term Trinity. He says that when we look at the death of Jesus, we can track it all back that it happened 41 years from the time of Augustus's rule, not the beginning of his rule. So by looking at that date of 2 BC, his rule actually begins under when his power and authority takes place, which is 2 years after the beginning of his defeat of Cassius, not Crassus, okay, but Cassius and Brutus, who helped form the second triumvirate. So Octavian, Cassius, and Brutus formed the second triumvirate, and then Octavian beats both of them in a host of series, poisoning each other. It's just a whole thing. We won't get through all that. But that his authority really began. He wasn't Caesar yet because these other guys were still around. But his authority and his power would have begun 2 years after the time of his beginning with the defeat of Cassius and Brutus, which would have put him in that same time frame that would have laid out for him to say, okay, how much money do I actually have to be able to govern this whole big thing called the Roman Empire? We're going to do a census to try to go figure out who's owed what. Tertullian also comes and tells us that all of that happened 30 years of the death of Jesus. It happened after the time of the death of Cleopatra. So again, he's using a different way to back up. That fits into the time frame as well. So the other thing that Tertullian tells us is that Augustus Caesar died 15 years after Jesus' birth. And Augustus dies in 14 AD. So that would then put the idea, 2 BC would fit within that time frame of exactly that 15 years after the time that Jesus was born, if indeed it was 2 BC, that 14 AD would have fit into that time frame. So the other person that has a lot of influence in this is Eusebius, and Eusebius is the father of church history. Eusebius says specifically there's other information that would put us to the 2 BC date. Hang with me, all right? One is that he references the course of Abijah. So if you look in 1 Chronicles 24, and you start to see how King David, is getting ready for the temple to be built. Remember, the Lord told David that he could not build the temple because he had too much blood on his hands. But Solomon, his son, was able to build the temple. But David put all the pieces and parts together, including paying for the land from the Jebusites on where the Temple Mount would be, which is still the same Temple Mount that is there today. But he put together the order of how they were going to do worship, and they called those a course. So it would have been a division, maybe in a way that we would say it. And he took from the Levites, he put out all these specific courses to say, of the people of X, you will go for a week. Of the people of Y, tribe, name of a person, right? Tribe, well, they all would have been Levites. But from this particular person, you will have been you will serve in the second week. And XYZ, you'll serve the third week. And all this is laid out in Chronicles. But Abijah is the name of one of those. I think he's the fourth one that actually takes place, that is given that course and that decision. So the way that would work, right, is that by the time you got to the age of Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, that's JTB is my laziness of putting that. By the time he actually has his interaction with Gabriel the angel, at the time after the time between the testaments, after that 400-year time period where the word of the Lord came to nobody, in what you and I would be able to read about in Luke chapter 1, when the angel Gabriel appears to Zechariah and says, you and your wife Elizabeth are going to have a baby. You drew lots. You drew different ways to figure out not only which of the other, you knew which course you were in, who you ultimately went back to as far as who was your ancestor, but whether it was your tribe or clan, by the time it got down to you, these old things would be all laid out, and then you were able to draw lots to figure out who was actually going to be able to serve in the temple. There were thousands of different priests who were running around in first century Jerusalem and trying to decide who was going to actually be able to do the priestly duties that particular week. Was a big deal. And so, but Zechariah would have known about all of that. Well, the other reference that we can use is from the Talmud, right? And the Talmud are these Jewish laws that are added to the Tanakh. The Tanakh is the Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament, and the Jewish Bible of the Tanakh, remember, are the same books. They're the same words. They're just put together in different order. So if you go back in the Talmud is above and beyond that, not in authority, but in able to kind of help to interpolate what is going on in the Tanakh, which is the full part of the Old Testament. As well as Josephus, both the Talmud and Josephus both say that the temple, all right, this is the third temple, this is Herod's temple, that it was destroyed on August the 5th, 70 AD by the Roman Emperor Titus. And you can go back and see Titus's arch in Rome and them hauling off the menorah and the Ark of the Covenant and all of that too. Okay, They both say from that date then that the temple was destroyed on that particular day of August the 5th, 70 AD. Both of those say that the course of priests that were ministering in the temple at the time of that it was destroyed was the first course. So maybe I got that wrong. Abijah may have been the first one instead of the fourth one. So I'm going from my memory and not from what I'm looking at, which is a little dangerous. But you can look that up. Okay, as we say, it's in the Bible. You can check it out. But they both say that when the temple was destroyed, the first course, Abijah's course, were the ones who were actually ministering in the temple when it was destroyed. And if you work back from there using the Jewish calendar, here's some more calisthenics, okay? If you work back from there using when that first course was, using the Jewish calendar, which you know is different than the calendar that we might use, but using that backwards from that, you would see that Zechariah was indeed ministering on the week of July the 3rd, 3 BC. So Zechariah would have been in the temple when Gabriel appeared to him in July of 3 BC. So what does that look like? Well, if we assume then that Elizabeth, Zechariah's wife, John the Baptist's mama, would have been a typical 280-day pregnancy from the time that Zechariah heard about it in the temple that day in July, that means John the Baptizer would have been born somewhere around April 19th or 20th, within that range, in 2 BC. I like to say April 19th because that's my wife's birthday. But somewhere in there, let's say you're off by a week, it's still not going to wreck the train, right? But it still gives you in that same time period. So if John the Baptist was born in April, let's just say the 19th or 20th of 2 BC, then the next thing for us to look at is when Mary comes to visit her cousin Elizabeth in Elizabeth's 6th month of her pregnancy. Luke 1, verse 36 tells us that Elizabeth was in her 6th month. So if you remember from that story, from that time, that John the Baptist started jumping around in his mama's tummy just because the Christ child was in Mary's womb. And because the two of them came together, John the Baptist started flipping around in Elizabeth's stomach, right? And so if that's the case, then Elizabeth's 6th month would have been in December of the 4th week of December in 3 BC, for him to be born in April of 2 BC. So if we assume also then that Mary had her typical term for her pregnancy of 280 days, when she was well enough along to be able to be seen to be with Elizabeth then in the 4th week of December of 3 BC, then from that time, of the time she was with Elizabeth, again, we don't know exactly, but if that was the case, then she would have gone her 9-month worth of term for being able to birth Jesus. And that would have put her right at the time of Rosh Hashanah that year, which is when the Jewish New Year would have started. And that Jewish New Year started on September 29th of 2 BC. Now, some of y'all are going to feel like you've just run a marathon of, oh my gracious, okay? I get it. But hopefully I've covered that well enough to know that I'm not promising this is the super duper absolute truth. But it's at least what I think has happened. So how does all that fit to history? How does that fit to what's going on within the Jewish nation? What's going on within who the different people were of when Herod actually ruled, and who the Parthians were? All of these things fit in to the whole idea of some Chris myths and what history may very well tell us about some of our Christian traditions. So if you want to reach out to us, there's our email address, cch@thecenterforchristianhistory.com. There's our website as well. I hope that you enjoyed this time for us to be able to have this ongoing learning session. Keep up with things that are coming up in the future. We've got several things lined up over the next couple of months that will show a whole bunch of diversity of different ideas and thoughts as it relates to Christian history. Thanks for your time.